Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 2. In this video, we're going to be examining the period of Red Terror. Now, really, this should be called just Terror because we are just looking at how terror was used throughout the Civil War by both the Reds and the Whites. So here's a quote from Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was, as you know, the head of the Cheka. He said, "The public and the press imagine the struggle waged against counter-revolution to be on the plane of normal state life, and consequently they wail about courts of law, about guarantees, about inquiries, investigators, etc. We stand for organized terror. This should be frankly stated." So he's making it pretty clear there that the Bolsheviks do not care for courts of law, do not care for inquiries. They will fight off counter-revolution by any means necessary. And if that means through terror, then so be it. So just a recap of our last video. It's been a while between videos, so it's important that we do a quick recap. So the early period of military opposition to the new regime was conquered by March 1918, but by mid-1918, a large-scale civil war had unfolded. The forces opposed to the Bolsheviks were known as the Whites, whereas the communist forces were the Red Army. There were also peasant guerrilla armies called the Green Armies. Foreign powers assisted the White armies, while Soviet Russia also fought a war with Poland in 1920, and this ended with the Treaty of Riga, which sort of brought an end to Lenin's hopes and the Bolsheviks' hopes of an international revolution. The White armies posed a significant threat to the Sovnarkom. However, a range of factors led to a Red victory by 1920, including geography, how they included Petrograd and Moscow, which had many of the ammunitions in Russia, and also much of the population. Their ideology led to a Red victory, so they were much more cohesive in their ideology, their communist ideology, than the Whites were. The nature of the Red Army and its leadership, so harsh discipline by Trotsky, and problems within the White forces, so disagreements, being geographically isolated and separate, and also poor leadership. Trotsky's leadership, as I said, played a significant role in the defeat of the Whites. So that's just recapping the Civil War. Today, we're looking at the same period of time as the Civil War, but we're looking at it from a different lens. So Red Terror. Now, the Cheka, which was, as you know, the secret police in Soviet Russia, led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, played an important role in crushing resistance to Bolshevik rule and ensuring that further opposition was discouraged. By March 1918, the Cheka had moved to its Lubyanka headquarters in Moscow and had grown to a staff of over 1,000 under Dzerzhinsky's leadership. And that grew from only 23 when the Cheka was first formed in December 1917. So they were growing rapidly. However, they were still quite a disorganized group. However, after mid-1918, Red Terror became more organized after a series of assassinations and assassination attempts. So on the 20th of June, SRs assassinated Moise Volodarsky, who was the commissar of the press. Then on the 30th of August, two things happened. Firstly, Moise Uritsky was assassinated by a trainee officer. Now, he was the boss of the Petrograd Cheka. And also on that same day, and this really was the catalyst for much more organized Red Terror, Lenin was shot and seriously wounded by SR Fanya Kaplan, or Fanny Kaplan. Now, it's important to note here that Lenin was seriously wounded. There were fears that he would die. He was pretty much out of action for months after this. But the attempted assassination of Lenin was blamed not only on the SRs, but also on the bourgeoisie. Cheka Deputy Yakov Peters declared the bullet was directed not only against Comrade Lenin, but also the working class as a whole. Now, on the 5th of September, so a few days after Lenin's assassination attempt, Sovnarkom passed a decree entitled On Red Terror, allowing for the creation of concentration camps to imprison class enemies and authorizing the Cheka to execute anyone involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies, and rebellions. Sorry, that should be in blue. So it was Dzerzhinsky and Sverdlov who passed this decree, and since Lenin was, of course, still recovering in the very early stages of his recovery. Now, thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries were arrested and put into concentration camps and Cheka jails. The Cheka was considered of equal importance to the Red Army in winning the civil war. Here is my very annoying dog. All right. So here are some primary source quotes on the Red Terror. So Martin Latsis, who was a Cheka deputy, issued instructions to his officials regarding the interrogation of prisoners. He said, first, you must ask him to what class he belongs, what his social origin is, his education and profession. These are the questions that must determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning of the Red Terror. So basically, if they are a bourgeois, they're a member of the bourgeoisie, then they should be, then they are guilty. Another Chekist disagreed with Lattis. He said, what purpose is served by all these questions of origins and education? One needs only to go into the kitchen and look in his soup pot. If there is meat in it, then he is an enemy of the people. Stand him up against the wall. And what he means by stand him up against the wall is stand him up and shoot. Dzerzhinsky said, as was quoted at the beginning there, we stand for organized terror. The Cheka is obliged to defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if its sword does by chance sometimes fall on the heads of the innocent. So basically, it doesn't matter if a few innocent people get killed as long as we are defending the revolution. One party newspaper, the Red Gazette, proclaimed, without mercy, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. For the blood of Lenin and Aritsky, let there be floods of bourgeois blood, more blood, as much as possible. Jeez Louise. And Martin Latsis said, again, we are not waging war against individual persons. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. So that gives you a sense of the mood in Petrograd amongst the Bolsheviks following Lenin's assassination attempt. Now, methods of terror. Now, this is where it gets a bit grim. There are many tales of gruesome torture techniques inflicted by the Chekists. The most common method of execution was a pistol shot at point blank range to the back of the head, but there are other examples such as shooting victims bit by bit, starting at the wrist and ending at the head, where one Cheka executioner did this, taking a sniff of cocaine between each shot. The quote-unquote glove trick, where the hand of a prisoner was held in boiling water until the skin came off like a glove. There was prisoners being rolled about in spiked barrels, using blunt saws to sever the bones of prisoners. In Kiev, pipes filled with rats and sealed at one end were placed against the victim's stomach and heated up. Desperate to escape, the rats would gnaw into the prisoner's body. So pretty gruesome torture techniques. Kiev Chekists also sometimes put prisoners into coffins with a rotting corpse, buried them alive, and then dug them out 30 minutes later. So really tough psychological torture as well. And another example of psychological torture is that sometimes the prisoner was brought into the execution room and an empty pistol was fired at their head. The prisoner was then returned to their cell, left to wonder when their real execution would occur. Now, as you can imagine, many members of the Cheka went insane from the psychological impact of their own actions. Cocaine and alcohol abuse was high, and generally a delivery of liquor to Cheka headquarters was a sign of an upcoming slew of executions. Most executions were carried out in Cheka jails. However, lists of those killed were published in newspapers. Commissar of Justice Nikolai Kurilenko argued that we must execute not only the guilty, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more. So just another example of a primary source quote on the Red Terror. Now, we've talked a little bit about Felix Dzerzhinsky before, but it's important that we revisit him when talking about the Red Terror, as he was the head of the Cheka who carried out all of this Red Terror. He said, the sooner we get rid of the bourgeoisie, the sooner we will reach socialism. Dzerzhinsky saw membership of the Cheka as a kind of higher calling. He said Chekists must be as pure as crystal. He also saw his role as the guardian of the revolution, and his Chekists were seen as noble crusaders, the so-called sword and flame of the revolution. Now, the Cheka symbol is literally a sword and shield with the hammer and sickle on the shield. So they were seen as the sword of the revolution. Dzerzhinsky was an avid revolutionary. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, often remaining in his office for days on end and just sleeping when he got tired. Historian W.H. Chamberlain described Dzerzhinsky as an old revolutionary of the most unimpeachable idealism, while historian Neil Harding argues that there was about him no hint of personal corruption or self-interested abuse of his massive powers. So he was a revolutionary as firm as they come. Now, corruption, on the other hand, was commonplace in the Cheka, and Dzerzhinsky ordered the execution of Chekists who took bribes and deducted alimony payments from the salaries of employees who were unfaithful to their wives. So he was he instilled harsh discipline as well, because he expected from his Chekists the same sort of pure nature and pure idealism that he himself held. Now, one instance of that took place during the Red Terror was the execution of the Romanovs. So Tsar Nicholas and his family, we haven't heard about them in a while, but they had been under house arrest in Yekaterinburg, Siberia, since Nicholas's abdication in March 1917. Now, when the provisional government was in power, they were held there, and it was, they weren't abused or anything like that. Once the Soviets came in power, then it got a little bit more dicey for them. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks were concerned during the Civil War, especially since this was in Siberia where Kolchak and his forces were. So the Bolsheviks were concerned that keeping the Tsar and his family alive would mean that if he were saved by white forces, then they could have a banner to rally around. As Sverdlov said, we decided the executions here. Lenin believed that we should not leave the whites a live banner to rally around. So on the 17th of July, I'm getting ahead of myself here. On the 17th of July, 1918, concerned by advancing white forces, Cheka authorities killed the royal family in the basement of the house. It's a pretty gruesome killing. So they were woken early in the morning and taken down to the cellar. There were seven Chekists for 7 people. However, none of the Chekists wanted to kill the children. And so the Tsar and Tsarina were killed first, with the children having to watch on in horror. Now, they were getting ready to be rescued. And so the children had been given all of these pearls and things like that. So treasures that they had hung around their neck, these riches that they were going to escape with. And so when the Chekas finally turned on the children and shot them, it took a long time for them to actually die because these treasures were protecting them. They were like a body armor. And so it was a pretty gruesome death for the Romanov family. There is historical debate over whether local officials had acted on their own or whether Lenin gave the order, but evidence does suggest that Lenin did give the order. So when Trotsky asked who ordered the executions, Sverdlov said what I said before, that Lenin believed we should not leave the whites alive, banner to rally around. And Trotsky later claimed the execution of the Tsar and his family was needed not only to frighten, horrify, and instill a sense of hopelessness in the enemy, but also to shake up our own ranks, to show that there was no retreating, that ahead lay total victory or total doom. So it was symbolic of the complete and utter end of Tsarism. Now, we've talked a lot about white terror. Let's also have a look at, red terror. Let's also have a look at white terror. So the whites also carried out acts of terror during the Civil War. They, for instance, nailed suspected communists to trees by their left hand and left foot. Socialist workers were buried up to their necks and ridden over by cavalry, and captured red soldiers had stars carved into their backs or limbs hacked off. General Kornilov instructed his men to take no prisoners. The more terrible the terror, the more victories. There are also instances of, on hearing that Bolsheviks killed those with clean fingernails and smooth hands, one white commander captured a factory and ordered the execution of any employee with calloused hands, i.e. all of the factory workers. Also, the whites were incredibly anti-Semitic, so pogroms against Jewish communities were common as a means to, quote unquote, let off steam. So in Ukraine, for instance, between 50,000 and 200,000 Jews were murdered. The whites targeted Jews for all the perceived wrongs of the new regime, just as the reds targeted the bourgeoisie for the wrongs of the SRs. So yeah, Jews were definitely a scapegoat for the white armies. Now let's have a look at some historians' interpretations of the Red Terror. So historians debate about whether the use of terror was a response to crises and threat, or whether it was a product of ideological intolerance, i.e. was it always planned or was it a response to circumstances? Orlando Fages says that the Bolsheviks were forced to turn increasingly to terror to silence their political critics and subjugate a society they could not control by other means, i.e. forced to turn suggests that he thinks that it was a response to crises. However, Richard Pipes claimed that the Red Terror was not a reluctant response to the actions of others, but a measure designed to nip in the bud any thoughts of resistance to the dictatorship. So Orlando Fages thinks that it was a response to circumstances, while Pipes thinks that it was a plan all along, and that the Bolsheviks were horrible, was a horrible group that always planned to instill terror. Dmitry Volkogonov said the leaders of the revolution had become priests of terror. Like the sound of a bolt being shot, the two syllables Cheka would stop any conversation. And the guillotine of the Russian Revolution was the gun. So there are just a few more quotes, not about this historical debate, but just some quotes by Volkogonov about the Red Terror. So final slide on historical interpretations of Red Terror. So the two sides are circumstances or intent, with Fages in the circumstances camp and Pipes in the intent camp. Rather than arguing over the question of whether Red Terror was intended as part of the revolution or whether it was a response to crises, historian Peter Holquist, someone we haven't heard of before, calls for a consideration of Bolshevik policies within their historical conditions, believing that the authoritarian state institutions of the Civil Civil War years were merely extensions of the period of 1905 to 1921, which was an epoch of violence. So he's saying that there was 16 years of violence, and that being a part of Russian society. He contends that the communist mentality and behavior, including the Red Terror, was a product of specific time and place, that if this violence had not been occurring for so long prior, then maybe terror wouldn't have been used in the Civil War. The actions of the Bolsheviks during the Civil War wouldn't have taken place. Anyway, I hope that you found this video useful. And in our next video, we'll be looking at the economic policies during the Civil War, known as war communism. So until next time, see you soon.